Good afternoon to all our attendees, and welcome to the webinar Conducting a Gender-Responsive Technology Needs Assessment. This webinar is hosted by UNEP DTU Partnership and organized in collaboration with CTCN and the University of Cape Town. My name is Leah. I'm working as a project assistant for the TNA project at UNEP DTU, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. A couple of things before we move to the main content. The session will last around 60 minutes and will include some time for a Q&A session. So you will be muted during this webinar, but you're more than welcome to write your questions through the chat box during the presentations that will be made by the speakers. And please remember to indicate the name of the speaker your question is asked to. And then we will be happy to answer the questions during the Q&A session. If you're not able to stay until the end of the session, or if you want to access our presentations again, you should know that all the materials and a recording of the webinar will be available online in a few days. So this recording will be available on the e-learning page of the TNA website. You will find the link of the website on the last slide of the presentation. So regarding the agenda of the webinar, we will start with an introduction about the TNA project that will be given by Sara Trærup. Then it will be followed by a guidance about gender-responsive TNAs that will be given by Jiska de Groot. And then we will end the presentation with Karina Larsen, who will show examples of successful gender-responsive projects and actions. Karina is currently experiencing some problems with the connection, but she will be joining, we hope, very soon. Finally, you will be able to ask questions in regard to this presentation during the Q&A session. And again, please don't forget to mention the name of the panelist that the question is for. So before we start, I would like to inform our attendees that we comply with the General Data Protection Act, also known as the GDPR. So it means that your personal data, such as name, email, and workplace, is safely processed and stored, and all your rights pursuant to the GDPR are respected. You have full access to the data being processed about you, and at any time you can request that inaccurate data be deleted or rectified. So for access or further information, you can contact Aris and Louise. Their contacts are indicated in this slide. Finally, I would like to briefly introduce the speakers of today's webinar. So Sara Trærup has joined UNEP DTU in 2005. She is both the Global Project Manager for the TNA project and the Regional Coordinator for Africa. Sara has supported developing countries in identifying their technology needs, and she helped build capacity for accessing finance for implementing the technologies countries have been choosing. Karina Larsen is responsible for the communication and the outreach strategy of CTCN, and she has over 20 years experience in global environment and health issues. She is the gender focal point of CTCN, so she advises and supports the secretaries on the implementation of gender mainstreaming with CTCN operation. Jiska de Groot. Jiska is a senior researcher at the ACDI. Her work focuses on the human dimension of sustainable energy access, energy poverty, gender, and capacity building. Jiska leads the capacity building component of a DFID-funded Transforming Energy Access Program. And Jiska is also coordinator of the support center of the TNA for Anglophone African countries. So thank you very much for listening to this introduction. I will give the floor to Sara Trærup, who will present the first presentation.
I will just start briefly by giving you a general introduction to what we call the Global Technology Needs Assessment Project. It is a project that is funded by the Global Environment Facility and is implemented by UN Environment through the UNEP DTU partnership. So what are we speaking about when we talk about technology needs assessments, and for many also technology action plans? Well, we speak about a set of activities that identify, analyze, and articulate the needs for technologies within both mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And it is an activity that is directed towards developing countries. It is a process that is country-driven, so it is not UNEP DTU or UNEP that are carrying out, so to speak, the technology needs assessments. It is national driven, so it is national teams. Each country has a TNA coordinator and a team of national consultants who work with working groups, national experts and stakeholders throughout the process of technology needs assessments and articulating of technology action plans. It is very much taking as a starting point that we build up the capacities in the countries to carry out these needs assessments. So this means that we carry out workshops both at a regional level but also at a national level to include as many stakeholders as possible. The TNAs do take as a starting point the national development objectives, and this also means that it's very different from country to country what is actually the objective that the country wants to achieve with their work on the technology needs assessments. But for most, and today it also takes as a starting point the national determined contributions that countries are preparing under the Paris Agreement. You could say thanks to the information that TNAs provide about the potential, the ability and scale of climate change technologies, they can play a unique role in the formulation and implementation of NDCs. We see that actions identified in countries' technology action plans highlight what needs to be done to, for example, activate robust market systems and the enabling conditions for technology transfer, diffusion, and uptake. And that these actions in turn strengthen longer-term strategies elaborated in the NDCs, in the national adaptation plans, NAPs, as well as potentially increasing the ambitions by making the means of implementation more concrete. Just to give you an overview of the countries that have participated or are participating in the global TNA project. Since 2009, we are getting close to 100 developing countries by this year that are part of this process. And my last slide before leaving the floor to Jiska is just to give you an overview of what we call the 3 main steps for the technology needs assessment process throughout the way to the technology action plans. So the first part countries are focusing on are really to identify and prioritize their key sectors. And within these key sectors for mitigation and adaptation, the technologies they need to develop their climate resilient strategies and obtain low carbon development strategies as well. The second step is on the barrier analysis and enabling frameworks, where countries take on their priority technologies from the first step to the second step. And for these priority technologies, countries analyze what are the market conditions, what are the barriers, and what are required to actually facilitate enhanced diffusion and uptake of these technologies. And finally, we have as a third step the technology action plans, which are really plans that articulate the actions needed for implementing these technologies, including the resources, the stakeholders, and so forth. And throughout these 3 steps, we do have capacity building. So we have a regional workshop for each of these steps, bringing together countries from the regions. And we do this also in close collaboration with our regional centers for the TNA project, where we have in Asia, we have Asian Institute of Technology. We have in Fiji for the Pacific region, we have the University of the South Pacific. We have University of West Indies in Jamaica to support the Caribbean countries. We have ENDA in Senegal to support the Francophone African countries. And then we have University of Cape Town to support our countries from Anglophone Africa. Throughout the process, we also have a range of guidebooks and methodologies and tools that we provide to the participating countries and their teams. These are also all available on the website. And finally, we also have a help desk that is run by the regional centers where countries can ask questions upon need. We also have the technical support missions to each of the countries participating, also carried out by our regional centers. So this was just to briefly introduce you to what are we talking about when we speak about the Technology Needs Assessment Project, and also how we support countries throughout this process. And just before I hand over to Jiska, one key aspect that we have identified in the past that were lacking attention was the gender aspects. We experienced that countries were not well aware of how to integrate it into the process of carrying out their technology needs assessments and technology action plans. So this is why we last year published a new guidebook on how to integrate gender, and we're lucky to have the author of that guidebook with us here today, which is Jiska de Groot, who is also based at University of Cape Town from our regional partner. So with this, I would leave the floor to Jiska.
Okay, thank you very much, Sara, and many thanks to you all for tuning in to this webinar. And in this presentation, really, I'll follow on from Sara's explanation of what the TNA is to really set some guidelines and ideas for helping to achieve the 3 steps of the TNA that Sara just outlined. And to do this, I'll first give a bit of a background on gender responsiveness for the TNA, followed by some insights into the key steps of the TNA, primarily the setup, the sector prioritization, the technology prioritization process, gender in the barrier analysis and enabling frameworks, and then finally on the technology action plan. So let's start from the beginning though. What is the need for gender responsive TNA? And before that comes another question, like what is gender exactly? And simply put, gender refers to the social, behavioral, and cultural attributes, expectations, and norms that are associated with being male or being female. And so what we're really talking about is a set of culturally specific characteristics that define the social behavior of women and men, boys and girls, as well as the relationship between them. So gender really is about women and men. And linking that straight into climate change, like women and men experience climate change very differently. And as gender inequalities persist around the world, it affects the ability of individuals and communities to adapt. But it's also really important to recognize the contribution of both women and men as decision makers, stakeholders, educators, carers and experts across sectors and at all levels. And that can really help us to achieve long-term solutions to climate change. And so the global negotiations have increasingly reflected this growing understanding of gender considerations, and continued progress in this field can help achieve successful climate action. And we are really hoping that the guidance that we're providing that will help people to put this into practice. And just to show you some of the examples of the gender gap in climate change. For example, according to this graph developed by UN Women in relation to water, in many countries, women and children spend 8 or more hours per day collecting water. So you can imagine that when water becomes increasingly scarce as a result of climate change, that increases the burden on specifically women and children here significantly. Then looking at decision making. Globally, women represent around 16.7% of government ministers, less than 20% of parliamentarians, and only 9% of them are head of state. And it's needless to say that that means that the main decisions in countries are made that are predominantly focused on the experiences, social norms, attitudes, and ideas of the male part of the population. So moving straight into the TNA now. So why do we need to take gender into account in this technology needs assessment? And gender mainstreaming, like, it's a process that can really help the countries involved in the TNA integrate gender issues into their assessment at all levels. And that includes understanding how gender roles, responsibilities, and inequalities affect the effectiveness of the TNA process, as well as the sustainability of its results. But also to make sure that the technologies are designed and implemented inclusively, and meaning in a way that they will close gender inequality gaps in climate-related technology transfer and implementation, and in a way that both women and men benefit from their development and are equally empowered as a result of it. And then a very, very practical one here also is to get action plans and technology proposals funded. Like, inclusion of gender is increasingly becoming a requirement for receiving climate change and development funding, and it's therefore essential to the TNA process, but also the countries that want to benefit from it. And so why is ensuring a gender responsive TNA important? And I can't stress it enough. It is that gender mainstreaming in the TNA process will result in better outcomes. And doing that, though, it requires planning and resources to really make sure that general principles that sound nice and that are idealistic, potentially, are really translated in action, because nothing happens without good planning and resources. And needless to say is that this focuses on both the level of the teams that are implementing the TNAs in their countries, as well as the TNA process more broadly. So that really leaves us with both a process and a content-focused transition that we're hoping that will extend far beyond these TNA processes only. And to really help our countries with these processes, we've prepared a detailed gender guidance, which you can access online, and the link will follow at the end of this presentation. And this guidance will help TNA teams, but also other people that are interested to really apply a gender lens to the prioritization of technologies, analysis of the barriers, and finally to develop a fundable, solid climate change proposal. So setup and preparation of the TNA. So this is really the first step here, and just two key aspects that need to be considered when you're setting up and preparing a technology process like the TNA. And the first one, it's really important to ensure that there's a good gender balance in the team that will be implementing it. And so what are the roles that are fulfilled by women and men, respectively, in the TNA process, and how may that affect outcomes? Like, you can imagine if the TNA team would be solely male or solely female, that could have consequences for the types of technologies selected, as there may be different preferences. And then secondly, the gender expertise that is present in the country team. So that includes setting up the TNA steering committee to ensure that gender targets are met at a national level. And it also means that there needs to be like a real consideration of selecting team members that have a knowledge of gender equality. And just an example here from the TNA process in Vanuatu, where you can see in the figure that they've made serious efforts to engage both male and female experts in the TNA teams. So looking at the TNA coordinator, but also the consultants, and especially in the working groups, where you see a balance between male and female that is much higher than the 30% that is often considered one of the maximum things to achieve. So then, focusing on the background research, it's also really important to know where the TNA process sits within the broader country context. And so, for example, how does it relate to existing country policies, strategies, and best practices for climate change and gender at both national and international level. And down to the sector level, there are several key questions that just need to be asked, and that start with, like, how does this TNA process relate to the gender equality processes at the national level? And that means for each of the chosen sectors and subsectors that will be addressed in your TNA. And also, how can the TNA help achieve gender goals in the specific adaptation and mitigation sectors? So as the background study is often quite heavily desktop experience-based and supplemented with expert conversations, some really good starting points here include, like, the SDG implementation and guidance documents, UNFCCC documents, but also qualitative and quantitative studies at national or international level. For example, World Bank country data, census data, health studies, documents from the UN, government, and other documents that the teams can get their hands on. But also the national and organizational documents that really relate to the sectors that the TNAs are addressing in their mitigation and adaptation efforts. For example, monitoring and evaluation reports of programs and projects. And not to forget third-party gender studies, gender analysis, and research papers in general. And that background study can provide, like, a really handy starting point where, for example, in the form of a written summary of development priorities and goals, really can help all the stakeholders to get on the same page and set the national context firmly in mind when conducting the rest of the TNA. And please note that because this background assessment is conducted anyway, it's just really key to make sure that gender considerations are integrated in this process of doing it, rather than to be considered an add-on, as is often the case. Moving to the technology prioritization process, the key questions that need to be looked at are, like, does the technology selected have the potential to address gender equalities? How can it contribute to achieving gender equality? And what is the expected magnitude of the impact on gender? And in this slide, which will be a bit easier for those of you that are familiar with the TNAs to understand, you can really see the entry points for incorporating gender in a process of technology prioritization. And so step one in there is the development of technology fact sheets. And it's really important to make sure that information and gender in relation to the technology is provided. And following that, the TNA process assesses technologies through a multi-criteria analysis. And it's also quite simple there. Gender needs to be a criterion that is assessed against the other technology options. And following this, the multi-criteria analysis will be discussed and evaluated through a stakeholder engagement process. And just make sure, again, these engagement processes need to be gender sensitive for step 1 and 2 to be actually carried out successfully. And then finally, when developing the output, so the output here is a short list of prioritized technologies, make sure that gender is presented and in that list for clarity and completeness of the process. And in this slide, there's just a few, it's just an example of how a TNA country that is in the current round 3 of the technology needs assessment has gone about prioritization in this multi-criteria analysis. Uganda has looked at gender in relation to a technology's ability to reduce labor demand for both women and men, but also a gender and disaggregated assessment of who's going to benefit from the technology. Is it men? Is it women? Is it youth? Is it all of them? And what is the ratio on that? But it also sets out to look at how technologies relate to existing norms and cultures. So whether it increases employment, and if it does, for who does it, and how it can cater for the needs of women, men, children, and youth. So moving from the technology prioritization to barrier analysis and enabling framework. So we have this list of technologies now that countries think would be suitable for addressing climate change in the country. So the next question is then, like, what are the barriers and enabling opportunities that there are in relation to the technology? And gender-related barriers need to be discussed and identified in that process. And just as an example here, when you look to the right under the capital goods, an example of a technology is small hydropower plants. And an example of a gender-related barrier to implementation is the fact that these technologies often come with a relatively high capital cost. And that makes it more difficult for many women to access because, unfortunately, they often have less access to capital than men do. And a corresponding gender-responsive enabling environment would then be to provide subsidies for women to increase access to finance. A second example related to adaptation is that of daily and seasonal weather forecasts via mobile phones as a technology as an adaptation measure. And the main question then becomes, like, who owns the mobile phone in a household that is not wealthy? So one of the things that we do know is that in many countries, men generally have more access to mobile phones than women do. And what we saw in the earlier slide that I brushed over slightly, with over 60% of women worldwide being responsible for the production of food crops, this is a problem. And ways in which to overcome this barrier, because it in the end will result in women not getting these seasonal and daily weather forecasts, is to consider different delivery modes of the message, for example, via radio, or take another approach and promote uptake of mobile phones among female subsistence farmers. And the enabling frameworks will, by implementing specific policies and activities like the delivery modes or the subsidies, help scale up climate change mitigation and activities that will improve gender equality. And this table here really shows a broad overview of enabling environment measures and how they can address these barriers. And you can see that they range from national macroeconomic conditions, where like subsidies could address high costs of capital, down to human, organizational, and institutional capacity. So really focusing on building capacity across programs and institutions to ensure better representation. But also when you look at research and technology, maybe consider stimulating STEM degrees among women to ensure a better balance in technological aspects. And then finally, like, this is a very important one to address, and a very sometimes difficult one, are social and cultural enabling environments where, like, information dissemination, awareness training, and outreach, they all need to be considered in a gender sensitive manner. For example, targeting women and men in their own respective areas of interest, or in modes that are suitable for both of them. And then the final, and definitely not the easiest step of the TNA, is the technology action plan. So how do you bring all of the previous steps and all the previous activities together to develop a plan that is gender responsive, is fundable, and will help address climate change? And I will now just briefly go through some of the predefined steps that are outlined for the technology action plan. So these are steps that have been developed to help the countries that are part of the TNA to really make it through the whole process and be able to put on the table a fundable plan. And I'm hoping to give you some ideas of where gender would fit into this process. Yeah, let me first remind you, though, that the technology action plan, it specifies, firstly, how to implement measures for technology implementation, but also who is responsible and when. and then thirdly, how funding is secured, and what the costs would be associated with the technology. So the TAP really is an important opportunity as well to ensure that gender is incorporated in the TNA country. And to achieve this, the TAP really needs to demonstrate tangible evidence that the project actively contributes to achieving specific gender equality goals. So to the right, you just see, so what are these goals of incorporating gender in the TAP? And that is firstly like to identify concrete gender-related actions that are needed for the successful implementation of technology in the country, but also have an indicative budget for each of the aspects of the project, which can be considered for funding by potential public or private funders, and to make sure that these two goals are achieved by the countries when developing their TAPs, and that they are reported on as well as disseminated. So yeah, now just very briefly going through these 7 steps. Firstly, like the step 1 is like the scale and ambition of the envisaged technology transfer is discussed in the TAP, and naturally that should include a well-defined ambition for gender. Following that, like identification and characterization of the actions that are really needed to realize these gender ambitions, and that includes a time frame, resources, and an inclusive multi-stakeholder process. Like remember when in the beginning I said that achieving gender mainstreaming of the technology needs assessment like requires planning and it requires resources. So that is where this comes back into play. Then thirdly, an identification of the stakeholders that will be involved in the implementation of the actions, as well as how these are scheduled and sequenced in the process. And some key questions there need to be asked again, and that is like, is there a balanced gender representation among the key stakeholders that you need for implementation? Is there at least one of them who has the necessary skills and expertise to provide the gender perspective and or gender perspectives to make sure that really the focus is on all the expertise that there is also in country or between countries to make this process happen, and that it's not a top-down activity. And also are stakeholders willing to seek women's participation during the implementation? And at this stage, it's essential to use a gender lens to ask the who, what, where, when questions to really determine how this is all going to happen. And quickly following on with step 4, there are really 2 key areas for gender that need to be detailed. And the first one are these ever important capacity building requirements for implementation of the TAP in country. As well as an estimation of the cost of the actions and activities, including gender-sensitive budget lines to make sure that objectives will be achieved. Then step number 5 is like risks, contingency planning, next steps and reporting. Like main gender issues in respect of like these more managerial activities are like, how will risks be addressed in relation to gender? For example, what do you do if the costs of gender mainstreaming are higher than expected? Like we all are aware of projects that we might have worked on ourselves, and suddenly a risk emerges that you might not have thought about, and hopefully that won't be a gender-related risk after this presentation. And then secondly, contingency planning to mitigate those risks. And for each of those gender-related uncertainties, it's important to draw up this like contingency plan to address the risk. So if you at some point lose your national gender expert or a stakeholder group, like is there a backup gender organization that you could approach? And then after that comes a very, well, somewhat simple task of collecting steps 1 to 5 in a series of tables, which can be accumulated in a spreadsheet and developed as part of the further TAP proposal. And yeah, so that really helps to report and track the implementation status. And that leads me to the final step like make sure to track implementation of the TAP. So as part of that, it's really essential that gender relevant indicators are developed as part of the TAP process. And these need to be carefully monitored and reported on in order to document the impact and demonstrate the effectiveness of the gender responsiveness, as well as progress with achieving gender goals. And just please don't read this slide, but I just really wanted to show you that when you follow all the above steps and when it goes successfully, like the 7-step plan will look something like this in practice. And in that you can demonstrate that in each step, gender is really considered. And so especially when your TAP gets used further, it's demonstrated to be ready to keep addressing gender, both in the project itself, but also to your country's climate change ambitions. And then in conclusion, please just see below the link to the guidance that we've developed, and that will help you in a step-by-step fashion to either make your own TNA gender responsive if you're already part of the TNA process. It might also get you ready for when your country's starting your own TNA process, or maybe it may help you make your own other technology plans better fundable and more gender responsive. So thank you very much for your time. And I will now hand over to the next speaker.
Sure. So my name is Karina Larsen, and I'm with the Climate Technology Center and Network. And a little bit about us, we work with a number of countries who ask us for assistance with many different types of technologies related to climate change and sustainable development. And I just wanted to share this page with you so you can get a sense of the various sectors that we cover. And so today I'd like to share with you just a few brief examples of how we work to incorporate gender in technology assistance. The first example that I'd like to share with you is a request that we received from the government of Pakistan related to technology needs assessment and an action plan. And we worked together with UDP on this particular intervention. And as we worked with the government, one of the areas that we looked at was in terms of the barrier analysis. So how is gender playing a role in that? Are there barriers in terms of how men or women can access and utilize various types of technologies? And then in looking at the various technologies that were under consideration for prioritization, we also considered social benefits. So two examples that that arose in this particular case were technologies that included solar pumps. So these have an obvious benefit in terms of achieving both energy and food security. But another factor is that because it's very often women who are retrieving water for drinking and household use, that the use of these types of solar pumps could create a time savings where their time could then be utilized for other activities. And in the similar situation with biogas, in the region, on average, biogas can save approximately 2 hours per day per family, as opposed to using or to the efforts that are normally taken for collecting biomass or preparing dung cakes and the cooking and cleaning of utensils that are associated with that process. So this is one example specific to the TNA process. But I also wanted to share with you work that we've done in West Africa related to adaptation to climate change and looking how gender should be considered in the planning and implementation. In 8 countries in West Africa, there was an interest to start to look at, on the whole, the coastal area and to classify the type of coast there was and how that will be impacted by climate change. And we used a tool in this case called the Coastal Hazard Wheel, and that's the image that you see in the slide. But before we even got started on this process, we wanted to do a comprehensive study to understand how coastal risks can affect communities. And in order to do that, we really wanted to look at how different stakeholders utilize the coast and are impacted by the coast. So we looked at For example, how do men and women use the coast for economic purposes? How is housing impacted or utilized in terms of coastal areas? And from that, we were able to look at some of the different gender differentiated vulnerabilities in these areas. And then as we got further into the process of the project and looking at how could we make sure along the way to incorporate those gender considerations, sort of the vulnerabilities and the ways the coast was used by men and women, into the planning and the management. So we wanted to make sure that throughout the process, gender was being incorporated. And then we also wanted to consider and identify factors that might encourage change in gender roles in the event that these would help in terms of management and future use of coastal areas. So this is one where you could see from the very beginning in terms of collecting the needed information through the planning and management, gender has been considered throughout. And of course, as the project will continue, we will look at, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, certain indicators that have been established related to gender as well, so that we can see if we're having the intended impact or if we need to adjust things along the way. And then I also wanted to share with you some research that we've done together with the Energy Resources Institute, TERI, of India, where we've been looking over the past year at examples of women's empowerment in the energy value chains in both India and Nepal. And it's widely recognized that in terms of the needs for energy, we need all women and men on board, and but it also energy can also serve to help women in terms of the other areas of their lives. So it really has a mutual value in terms of considering gender and energy. And I wanted to share with you one of the case stories today, which is the improved clean cooking. And that case study takes place in Karnataka in India, a rural area, where, like in many parts of the world, women are exposed to significant indoor air pollution from inefficient firewood cook stoves. And a local NGO there launched a clean cook stove program, where rural women are trained as clean cook stove builders, and they in turn train women in other areas to build and maintain clean stoves. So women who complete these trainings are given their own cook stove molds to begin building stoves. And that's an activity that they can engage in during the 3 to 4 months a year when they're not quite as busy with agricultural work. And this program has really shown that designing clean household technologies or other technologies with the input of women, who may be the primary users in this case, will better meet their needs and therefore achieve a higher adoption rate for the technology. And it was also found that engaging women directly to promote the use of the stove was more successful than engaging men in households, as women who were building and providing the cook stoves felt more comfortable communicating with other women and could more easily explain the benefits in a relatable way. The income earned by women stove builders has enabled them to have more decision-making ability in the home. And it's also created social ties as women train together and then meet with other women from their communities. So this project has actually become so popular and recognized that it's now supported by the Karnataka State Forest Department and the Department of Science and Technology within the government, because it's recognized as a really effective program and supporting other forest measures in the region. And I would encourage you, if you are interested, to visit the web link at the bottom of this screen, where you can read about the other case studies. And there are also some more general information about looking at gender through the energy value chain and how to make sure that it's incorporated at each stage of project development and implementation. So I will leave it here and then pass over to Leah, and I'm happy to take any questions following her comments.
Thank you very much, Karina. And thank you everyone for these interesting inputs and presentation. So we have received some questions from the audience. Thank you all for sharing questions, and please feel free to ask more questions if you have any. So I have a question for Sara. a more general question about the TNA process. And the question is, how are participating TNA countries selected? So are they approaching you or do you approach them? So if you could give some inputs about the processes of becoming a TNA country.
Hi, so thank you for this question. And it is a project that is driven by countries. So countries become part of the TNA project upon request. And it is currently SIDS and LDCs that are eligible for the global set-aside with the Jehl for the project, and other developing countries can use their star allocation. We also currently have a country as Ukraine, who is also using their own star allocation for joining the project. So it is upon country request, and if any information is needed, you are welcome to write me. I think my email is also on the techaction.org website under the contact, and I'm happy to respond to any questions on this regard. But it is upon country requests, and that can go through UNEP DTU.
Thank you very much, Sara. We have another question. This is for Jiska. So if there is no gender expert in the country, do you provide any training for taking gender aspects into consideration in climate technology projects?
So for the countries, thank you very much for that question, first of all. So for the countries that are already part of, say, the TNA 3, which is what we are in now, the respective areas that are covered by the different help desks will be able to provide gender assistance there. I'd also, if it's one of the other countries, I'd also be very happy for them to send me an email directly, so that we may be able to help them reach out to gender experts in their own country that they might not have been aware of, or link them across countries with similar sector responses, or countries that have similar profiles. So great. I guess, yes, we are here to assist, but we, in addition to the guidance that we developed and webinars like this, we don't have say, like a 2-3 day training for it.
Great, thank you very much, Jiska. We have another question or comment for you. So I will simply read the question, which is a bit long. So one can say that there is a solid statistical correlation between the increasing of the share of women in government and decrease of birth rate in that same country. So how would you say it should be implemented to deal with this question or react on such an opinion during the TNA preparation process?
Okay, I hope I understand this question correctly. So if there's this relationship between an increased amount of women in government and in decision making and reducing birth rates, that I think what is very important to ask there is, like, why is the birth rate decreasing, and what measures have been put in place to make that happen? And if that is the result of this improved gender balance in the governmental process, then then that is documentable. Could you repeat, though, the final part of the question, because I'm not sure if I understood that.
Yeah, so it was just about if you had some recommendation on how to leverage this idea when implementing the TNA process.
I would say everything starts with documenting it. So trying to generate the evidence that shows the impact, and when you have that, or when you know that these activities are working, then try and integrate them further into the rest of your plans.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question for you, Jiska. how to engage adult women on digital technologies use in communities where mobiles are mainly used by men and the youngest population.
So this is quite a specific question in terms of answer. So I think what the example really tried to show here is that it's important to, when you come up with the technology, to have an idea of what is happening by the end user. So are women, are men using the technology, and if you have a discrepancy between in gender, how are you going to solve that? And that, for example, then could include training on mobile phone on mobile technologies for women, but it might also be that is not your right solution, and that you just have to go the other way around and do say radial broadcasting or other ways to reach women if you can't address the mobile phone aspect. So, but that again requires an understanding of your target population.
Okay, thank you very much, Jiska. I have one question for Sara. So we have a message from Somali Greenpeace Association. Is there possibilities for NGOs to partner to the TNA program?
Yes, and thank you for that question. It's something that we continuously encourage the countries to do. So we would encourage the inclusion at the country level. Since it is a stakeholder-driven project, we encourage countries to include representatives from all groups, including also from NGOs. So if this was a question from Somalia, then I would actually encourage you to engage with the TNA in Somalia, which is actually starting up middle of this year. So that's actually quite a good opportunity to get engaged in the process from the very beginning. So I would say yes, very much, especially both at the national level, and then we at the global level also engage more with NGOs in, for example, doing joint sessions and so forth. But it's really happening at the country level. So for most countries, it is the case that NGOs participate in working sessions, in stakeholder consultations, and so forth.
Great. Thank you very much, Sara. I have a question addressed to Karina. Have you developed a hazard wheel and is it available for non-coastal countries?
Thank you for that question. So the hazard wheel right now has been developed for coastal use. So it's a way to sort of drill down in terms of the various factors related to coasts. So it's not available as such for areas outside of coastal areas. But if there's interest in that particular tool for coastal management, that you can read more about it on our website. If you look under technical assistance and select, for example, Cameroon, then you can find information on this project, or you can contact me directly, and I'm happy to share with you. It would be lovely to have a similar type of tool for other landscapes, but that's not been developed, at least from our side as of yet.
Great, thank you very much. I have another question for you, Karina. Is there any capacity building program from the CTCN that countries can get help from while developing gender responsive project proposal? Or are there any events countries can participate in the future?
Yes, so we can provide assistance in that type of work, incorporating gender into projects and programs. And there are a number of ways that can be done. So an organization or a government representative or even a private sector representative can request technical assistance from the CTCN, and then we can provide assistance in developing project proposals or helping to plan how gender can be best incorporated. But we also provide a lot of capacity building on gender areas, and we conduct, for the last couple of years, we've conducted an upscaling workshop on gender just solutions, which provides a lot of guidance on how to look at projects and also organizations' work in terms of the technology needs, the economic needs, and also advocacy needs to upscale projects. And we also collect a lot of very good examples from around the world on our website, on our Gender Hub. So there are different ways to seek assistance from the CTCN in terms of gender, and we would definitely encourage you to get in contact if that is of interest, and then we could see what might be the best modality.
Great, thank you very much. One question for Jiska. What are the challenges that have been encountered by countries when developing or implementing gender-responsive TNAs? And I could add, what are your suggestions to leverage these difficulties?
Okay, so it depends very much on what country you're in. So some countries really come from a situation where it is very difficult to even identify get a good gender balance in their country teams or in their TNA coordination teams, all the way down to countries that have a good gender balance there, that have a lot of gender experts in the country. So the challenges range from the TNA team level all the way down to countries where social and cultural or religious norms prevent women from getting active in a lot of activities. So it's very difficult to now give a one-size-fits-all on overcoming these issues, and that would just really need to be looked at on like a country-to-country basis, because I really try and avoid to make any sweeping statements here.
Okay, great, thank you. One last question before closing the webinar, addressed to Sara. Sara, do you have a framework in place for doing quantitative monitoring and evaluation of the TNA impact on gender balance?
Yeah, so thank you for that question also very much. It is the first time we are given guidance on how to integrate gender aspects into the TNAs. So it is something that we continuously are taking stock of, and we have actually by now synthesized the information that countries have provided in their first deliverables, what we call the TNA reports, and we will continue doing so. So this also means that we do statistical analysis of the data we get through the reports submitted by countries, and we will use that information through our reporting, but also through when we, for example, last year in Madrid, we held a side event together with the CTCN and the Women and Gender constituency, and we presented the information that we have extracted from the TNA report. So to respond to the question, yes, we do extract the information through more quantitative means, and as the reports are coming in during the next year or so, we will have even more data to build on.
Great, thank you very much, Sara. So it's time to close the webinar. So first, thank you very much for the detailed answer to all these questions, and thank you very much for all the active participation of the audience. So we hope that the presentation will be very beneficial for all of you. And remember that this webinar has been recorded, so it will be available on the TNA website in the coming days. You can see the link of the TNA website on that slide. So please feel free to contact us if you have any questions. And remember to consult the e-learning page of the TNA website. Thank you all for your attention, and we wish you a very good day from Copenhagen. Bye.